Is this some kind of joke? The sergeant's voice, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the cavernous echo of the hangar. He gestured with a greasy rag toward the old man standing near the wing of the F-35, a machine that looked like a captured piece of the future. This is a restricted area, Pops. You can't just wander in here and start sightseeing. Elias Vance, 84 years old and moving with the careful economy of a man who knew his body's limits, simply turned his head. His eyes, a pale but startlingly clear blue, took in the sergeant. He didn't speak. His stillness seemed to irritate the younger man even more. The Sergeant Miller had a name tape that read just that, stitched neatly above the pocket of his fatigues. He was a man who thrived on order and bristled at any disruption to his meticulously controlled world, and this old man, in his simple civilian slacks and worn windbreaker, was a disruption of the highest order. "I asked you a question," Miller snapped, taking a step closer. The air smelled of jet fuel and ozone. A handful of young airmen, busy with their checklists and maintenance routines, paused their work, their eyes darting between the sergeant and the silent old man. They sensed the friction, the imminent collision of authority and quiet defiance. Miller noticed their attention and his posture straightened, puffing his chest out. He was performing now. "Look, I'm getting this bird ready for a Codel visit. That's a congressional delegation, in case you don't know. Bigwigs, I don't have time for this. Who let you in here?" Elias still didn't answer the question directly. Instead, his gaze drifted back to the fighter jet. He ran a hand, thin and papery with age, along the cold composite skin of the wing. It was a gesture of familiarity, almost of kinship. This only seemed to enrage Miller further. He saw it not as reverence, but as a proprietary touch, an unearned intimacy with a machine the sergeant considered his own. "Hey, don't touch that," Miller barked, his voice bouncing off the high, curved ceiling of the hangar. "That is a $200 million piece of United States Air Force property. Your grubby hands don't belong on it." The airman flinched at the sergeant's tone. It was unnecessarily harsh, a verbal shove aimed at a man old enough to be their great-grandfather. One of them, a young airman first class named Chen, felt a knot of shame tighten in his stomach. The old man wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just looking. There was a quiet dignity about him that made the sergeant's aggression feel like sacrilege. Miller, enjoying his audience, decided to escalate. He stomped over to a utility closet, the metal door groaning as he wrenched it open. He emerged holding a long wooden mop with a grimy, fibrous head. He walked back to Elias and thrust it toward him, handle first. "You want to be in my hangar so bad? You want to get close to the equipment?" Miller said with a sneer. "Fine, make yourself useful." He shoved the mop into Elias's hands. The wooden handle was smooth from use. Elias looked down at it, then back up at the sergeant. For the first time, a flicker of something moved across his placid features. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was a distant, fleeting look of something like irony. He took the mop. "The floor around Bay 4 needs a good swabbing," Miller commanded, pointing to a section of concrete stained with hydraulic fluid and grime. "Get to it. I want to be able to see my reflection when you're done." The other airmen looked away, suddenly finding their tasks intensely interesting. They didn't want to witness this. It felt wrong, a violation of some unspoken code. Humiliating a subordinate for a mistake was one thing. This was something else entirely. This was cruelty for sport. Elias, however, simply nodded. He held the mop not with the awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to labor, but with a surprising efficiency. He found a bucket, filled it with water and solvent from a spigot, and began to work. His movements were slow but methodical. He started at one end of the designated bay, pushing the mop in long, even strokes. He didn't look up. He didn't complain. He just cleaned. Miller watched him for a moment, a smug grin on his face. He'd made his point. He'd put the old man in his place and reasserted his dominance over his domain. He turned to his crew. "All right, you heard me. We've got senators coming. This place needs to be spotless. Let's get back to work." The airmen went back to their duties, but the atmosphere in the hangar had shifted. It was heavy, sour. The rhythmic slosh and scrape of the old man's mop provided a somber soundtrack to their work. Chen kept stealing glances at Elias, whose back was now to them. He was methodically working his way across the concrete floor, his frail-looking shoulders moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. Miller couldn't leave it alone. The old man's compliance was almost more infuriating than defiance would have been. He wanted a reaction. He walked over, ostensibly to inspect the work. "Put some elbow grease into it, Grandpa," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're leaving streaks." Elias paused his mopping and looked at the floor. He dipped the mop back into the bucket, wrung it out with a practiced twist and went over the spot again, his movements precise. He was treating it not like a punishment, but like a task that deserved to be done right. Miller's eyes narrowed, searching for another point of attack. He noticed a small, worn leather pouch on the old man's belt. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, secured by a simple brass snap. It looked out of place with the man's otherwise plain attire. "What's in the purse, old-timer?" Miller taunted. "You're knitting." "A bag of hard candy." Elias stopped mopping again. He placed a hand on the pouch, a protective, almost unconscious gesture. His pale blue eyes met Miller's. "Just a few memories," he said, his voice quiet but clear, the first words he'd spoken to the sergeant. The quiet words seemed to snap something inside Miller. The lack of fear, the complete absence of intimidation. It was a direct challenge to his authority. "Memories. Let me see. Base regulations. No personal effects in the maintenance area. It could be a security risk." He reached for the pouch. Elias didn't flinch, but his hand tightened on the leather. For a tense second, it seemed a physical confrontation was inevitable. The air crackled. The hum of the hangar's ventilation system seemed to fade into a dull roar. The worn leather of the pouch felt impossibly soft under Elias's fingers. As Miller's hand reached out, the texture transported him. It was no longer the smooth, polished concrete of a modern hangar beneath his feet, but the sucking mud of a rice paddy under a monsoon-gray sky. The pouch on his belt felt heavier, its contents a lifeline. Inside wasn't candy, it was a signal mirror, a button compass, and a single water-damaged photograph of a woman he hadn't yet married. He remembered the feel of a fellow pilot's blood on his hands as he used the compass to navigate them away from the wreckage of their downed Phantom, the glint of the mirror as he desperately flashed it at a speck in the sky that might be friend or foe. The pouch wasn't for memories, it was the reason he had any memories to carry at all. It was the tool that had bought him the rest of his life. He could feel the phantom weight of it, the desperate hope it represented, a stark contrast to the petty humiliation of the present moment. Airman Chen couldn't stand it anymore. This had gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Watching the sergeant try to physically take something from the old man was the final straw. He set his torque wrench down with a quiet clink, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline and a sense of righteous anger. He knew challenging Sergeant Miller directly would be career suicide. There was a proper way to handle this, a way that went around the sergeant, not through him. He slipped away from the main work area, moving behind a large yellow maintenance stand, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled out his personal cell phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He couldn't call security forces. They would likely just side with the NCO on the scene. He needed someone with perspective, someone who understood the base and its history. He scrolled through his contacts and found the number he was looking for. Master Sergeant Reyes, the senior NCO at the base command post. Reyes was a legend himself, a man who had seen everything and forgotten nothing. Chen pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear, his voice a hushed, urgent whisper. "Master Sergeant Reyes, this is Airman Chen over at Hangar 7. "Chen," Reyes's voice was calm, gravelly. "What's going on? You're not supposed to be on your phone on the flight line." "I know, Master Sergeant. I'm sorry, but something's happening. Sergeant Miller, he's got this old man here, a civilian visitor. He's making him mop the floor." Chen's words came out in a rush. "He's humiliating him in front of everyone, sir. Now he's trying to take a pouch from him. Chen could picture Reyes leaning forward in his chair, his full attention now on the call. "An old man? A civilian? Did he give you a name, Chen?" "I think so, Master Sergeant. When he first came in, he checked the visitor log. I think his name was Vance. Elias Vance." The silence on the other end of the line was instantaneous and profound. It was a heavy, loaded silence that made the hairs on Chen's arms stand up. When Reyes finally spoke, his voice was completely different. The calm, gravelly tone was gone, replaced by one of shocked, cold urgency. "Airman Chen," Reyes said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Say that name again for me." Slowly. "Elias Vance," Chen repeated, spelling it out. "Vance." He heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of a chair scraping violently against a linoleum floor. "Chen, listen to me very carefully," Reyes commanded, his voice now a whip crack of authority. "Where is Sergeant Miller right now? Is he still with Mr. Vance?" "Yes, Master Sergeant. They're right by the nose of the F-35. Keep them there. Do not let that man leave. Do whatever you have to. Make an excuse, but keep him in that hangar. Do you understand me, Airman?" "Yes, Master Sergeant. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Chen stood frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to his ear, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the hangar's temperature. He had no idea who Elias Vance was, but he knew with absolute certainty that Sergeant Miller had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Inside the base command post, a controlled chaos erupted the moment Master Sergeant Reyes disconnected the call. "Get me the base commander," he roared to a young officer at the command console, his voice echoing through the normally quiet operations center. "Now, and get me Colonel Evans from the operations group and the wing historian. I want them on the line, I don't care what they're doing." The young lieutenant fumbled with his console. "Master Sergeant, what's the nature of the The nature is that a living legend is being forced to mop a hangar floor by an idiot tech sergeant," Reyes bellowed, his face flushed with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He was already typing furiously into his own terminal, pulling up a restricted personnel file. The screen flickered, and a grainy black and white photo from decades ago appeared next to a string of text. The base commander, Colonel Wallace, a stern man in his late 40s, picked up the dedicated line in his office. "What is it, Reyes?" "Sir," Reyes said, his voice tight with protocol despite the urgency. "We have a situation in Hangar 7. It involves a civilian visitor named Elias Vance." There was a pause. "Vance," Colonel Wallace repeated. Not the Elias Vance. "The one and only, sir," Reyes confirmed, his eyes scanning the file on his screen. "Medal of Honor recipient. 2 silver stars. Distinguished Flying Cross with 4 oak leaf clusters. Over 300 combat missions in 2 wars. The man who landed a crippled F-4 Phantom on a carrier deck with no landing gear and 1 engine on fire. That Elias Vance, sir." The silence from the colonel's office was deafening. Reyes could hear the faint sound of a pen dropping onto a desk. "Where is he, Master Sergeant?" Wallace's voice was dangerously calm. "In Hangar 7, sir. Sergeant Miller of the 33rd Maintenance Squadron has tasked him with cleaning duties." Reyes chose his words carefully, but the implication was clear. "My God," Wallace breathed. He was no longer speaking to Reyes but to himself. Then his voice came back, cold as steel. "Reyes, you have the con. Lock the gates. Nobody enters or leaves Hangar 7. I want security forces to form a perimeter, but they are not to enter until I arrive. Get me a visual on the hangar floor feed, and get General Peterson's office on my other line. The 4-star is on this base today for the Codell visit. He's going to want to know why his old flight instructor is being treated like a janitor." Reyes was already executing the commands. The command post, a hive of quiet efficiency moments before, was now a whirlwind of focused activity, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. The name Elias Vance had acted like a lightning strike, galvanizing the entire base leadership into immediate frantic action. Back in Hangar 7, Miller was feeling triumphant. The old man had finally relented, stepping back from the pouch, though his hand still hovered near it. Miller saw this as a win. He had faced down the old man's quiet insolence, and had come out on top. Now for the final stroke. "All right, that's it," Miller declared, stepping back and crossing his arms. "I've had enough of your games. You're a security risk and you're being willfully non-compliant. You're coming with me." He gestured to 2 of his larger airmen. "Jenkins, Smith, escort this man to the security forces building. Tell them he's to be detained pending a full background check and a psychological evaluation. I think he might be confused." The 2 airmen looked at each other, then at the old man, their hesitation obvious. They had signed up to fix jets, not to strong-arm senior citizens. "Did you hear me?" Miller's voice rose. "That's an order." Reluctantly, Jenkins and Smith began to move forward. Elias watched them approach, his expression unreadable. He wasn't scared, he just looked tired. He lowered his hand from the pouch and leaned the mop against the fuselage of the F-35, a final quiet act of surrender. It was the moment Miller had been waiting for, the complete and total validation of his authority. He allowed himself a small, cruel smile. It was at that exact moment that the world outside the hangar doors changed. The distant familiar sounds of the flight line were suddenly drowned out by the urgent wail of sirens. Not one, but a chorus of them, growing louder at an alarming rate. They weren't the high-low yelp of an ambulance or a fire truck, but the piercing, authoritative shriek of military police escorts. Every head in the hangar snapped toward the massive multi-story bay doors. Red and blue lights flashed against the reinforced windows, painting the interior in strobing, frantic colors. The sirens grew to a deafening crescendo right outside and then abruptly cut off, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the slamming of car doors. The small pedestrian access door flew open and a security forces airman, weapon held at a low ready, stepped inside, his eyes wide. He scanned the scene, his gaze locking on Sergeant Miller, then the old man, then the 2 airmen about to lay hands on him. Before he could speak, the main bay doors, large enough to admit the fuselage of a cargo plane, began to rumble open. Sunlight flooded the cavernous space, silhouetting a procession of vehicles that had screeched to a halt on the tarmac just outside. At the front was the base commander's official black sedan, its flag flying from the fender. Flanking it were two security forces patrol cars, their light bars still flashing. Behind them was another sedan and a medical vehicle. Doors opened in unison. Uniformed personnel disembarked with a crisp, practiced urgency. From the lead car stepped Colonel Wallace, his face a mask of controlled fury. From the second car emerged another full colonel, and a man in a flight suit with the silver eagles of a colonel on his collar. They didn't run, but they moved with a purpose that was far more intimidating. Their eyes scanned the hangar, ignoring the gleaming fighter jet, ignoring the assembled airmen, and locking onto the single stooped figure of the old man standing with a mop. The three colonels, followed by a phalanx of senior NCOs including Master Sergeant Reyes, marched into the hangar. Their boots echoed on the concrete, a thunderous, rhythmic advance that made every heart pound. They walked straight past Sergeant Miller as if he were a piece of furniture. The airmen, including Jenkins and Smith, instinctively snapped to attention, their backs ramrod straight. Colonel Wallace came to a halt 3 feet in front of Elias Vance. The entire hangar held its breath. The colonel's eyes took in the scene, the bucket of grimy water, the mop leaning against the fighter jet, and the calm, tired face of the old man. The commander's expression tightened, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Then, in a movement so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, Colonel Wallace brought his hand up in a salute. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was a salute of the highest, most profound respect reserved for dignitaries and heroes. "Mr. Vance." The colonel's voice was loud, clear, and ringing with an emotion that sounded like awe. "Sir, on behalf of the entire command, I want to apologize. I had no idea you were on my base today. It is an honor to have you here." Elias looked at the saluting colonel and simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Sergeant Miller stood frozen, his jaw slack, his face draining of all color. His brain struggled to process the scene. Colonels did not salute civilians. They certainly didn't address them as sir. Colonel Wallace dropped his salute and turned to the assembled personnel, his voice now booming through the cavernous space. "For those of you who don't know," he began, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the airmen, before finally landing on Sergeant Miller with the force of a physical blow. "This is Mr. Elias Vance. Let me tell you who you have in your presence." He took a breath. This man enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps in 1944. He flew P-51 Mustangs over Europe. When his service was done, he came home. But when the call came again, he joined the newly formed Air Force and flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, where he became an ace. But he wasn't done. The colonel's voice grew stronger, a recitation of a legend. During the war in Vietnam, flying an F-4 Phantom, then Major Vance and his wingman were shot down deep in enemy territory. His wingman was badly injured. For 3 days, Major Vance evaded capture, carried his wounded comrade on his back, and held off enemy patrols with just his service pistol until a rescue team could extract them. For this action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor by the President of the United States. A collective gasp went through the hangar. Airman Chen felt his knees go weak. Sergeant Miller looked like he might faint. "He retired a colonel," Wallace continued, his gaze still locked on Miller. "He went on to become one of the most respected test pilots of his generation, flying every piece of experimental hardware we had, pushing the envelope so that you all," he gestured to the F-35, "could fly the safest, most advanced aircraft in the world. The flight control software in that very jet is based on principles he helped pioneer. He is not a guest here. He is the foundation upon which this hangar was built." The colonel fell silent. The silence was absolute. The weight of the words of the history pressed down on everyone. The young airmen stared at Elias, no longer seeing a frail old man but a titan, a figure from the pages of their own institutional history brought to life. They looked at the mop he had been holding, and a wave of collective shame washed over them. Colonel Wallace finally turned his full, undivided attention to the pale, trembling Sergeant Miller. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His voice was a low, glacial whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any scream. "Sergeant, you will report to my office in 5 minutes. You will be accompanied by your first sergeant and your squadron commander. I suggest you use the time to contemplate the magnitude of your failure, not just as a non-commissioned officer, but as a member of the United States Air Force." Miller could only manage a choked, "Yes, Colonel." Wallace turned back to Elias, his expression softening instantly. "Sir, General Peterson is on his way. He was your student at test pilot school, I believe. He insisted on greeting you personally." Elias finally spoke, his voice the same quiet, steady tone as before. He looked at the colonel, then at the petrified Sergeant Miller. He reached out and gently placed a hand on the colonel's arm. He's a young sergeant, Colonel. He's proud of his hangar. He wants to keep it clean. There's no shame in that. He then turned and picked up the mop, holding it out to Miller. A clean floor is the sign of a disciplined mind, Sergeant. You run a tight ship. He handed the mop back to the man who had given it to him as an insult. Miller took it, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the wooden handle. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The gesture was not one of forgiveness, not yet, but of something far more profound, a lesson in grace from a man who had earned the right to show none. As Elias turned away from the stricken sergeant, his hand brushed against the worn leather pouch on his belt. For a fleeting moment, he was no longer in the hangar. He was 25 years old, huddled in the wreckage of his saber jet on a frozen Korean hillside. The canopy was shattered, the wind a physical blow. His hands were numb, clumsy with cold, as he fumbled with the snap on the very same pouch. He pulled out not a compass, but a small waterproof tube containing a flare. He remembered the desperate prayer he'd uttered as he struck the cap, the brilliant red glare blooming against the endless white snow, a beacon of hope in a world of despair. That flare, launched from a tool carried in that pouch, had been the only thing that guided the rescue chopper to his position. The pouch wasn't a souvenir. It was a promise he had made to himself to survive, to endure, to come home. In the weeks that followed, a quiet but seismic shift occurred at the base. Sergeant Miller was not discharged, but he was removed from his supervisory role. He was formally reprimanded, his career trajectory irrevocably altered. More significantly, Colonel Wallace mandated a new base-wide training initiative. It was called the Vance Program. Every month, all personnel from the newest airmen to the senior leadership attended a seminar on Air Force heritage. They didn't just study dates and battles, they studied the stories of the men and women behind them. Veterans from local communities were invited to speak, to share their experiences, to bridge the gap between the heroes on the walls and the airmen walking the halls. The story of Elias Vance and the mop became a quiet legend on the base, a cautionary tale passed down from NCOs to their subordinates in hushed tones. It was a story about respect, humility, and the danger of judging a book by its cover. About a month after the incident, Miller, now working a desk job in the squadron's administrative office, was walking through the base exchange. He saw Elias Vance sitting at a small table in the food court, slowly sipping a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. Miller's heart began to pound. He could have turned and walked away. No one would have blamed him. But the new training, the endless hours contemplating his actions, had changed something in him. He took a deep breath and walked over to the table. He stood there for a moment waiting. Elias eventually looked up from his paper, his pale blue eyes recognizing him instantly. There was no anger in them, no judgment, only a quiet patience. Miller stood at attention. "Sir," he said, his voice clear and steady, "I never properly apologized. What I did was inexcusable. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I am truly sorry for the disrespect I showed you." Elias looked at him for a long moment, then folded his newspaper and set it on the table. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, son," he said. Miller hesitated, then slowly sat down. "You know what the most important part of an airplane is?" Elias asked, his voice soft. "The engine, sir? The wings?" Miller guessed. Elias shook his head. "It's the person in the cockpit, and the person with the wrench, and the person who sweeps the floor to make sure that person with the wrench doesn't slip and fall. Every part matters. You just forgot to see all the parts." He took a sip of his coffee. "Don't make that mistake again." Miller nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I won't, sir. I promise." He sat there for a while longer, in comfortable silence, sharing a table with the legend he had tried to humiliate. It was a quiet end to a loud lesson, a moment of grace that Miller knew he hadn't earned, but one he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. Thank you for watching Veteran Valor Stories. If this story moved you, please honor our heroes by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to our channel for more tales of unassuming courage.